Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for this conversation. We're really pleased to see you here. My name is Katie Anton. I'm the director at the Arlington Arts Center, and I'm pleased that my colleague Blair has put together this program, especially for Pride Month. So, Blair?
Thanks so much, Katie. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here with us tonight. The conversation tonight is happening in conjunction with one of our current exhibitions, which is part of Solos 2022. If you're not familiar with Arlington Arts Center, we have a program called Solos, where artists can propose solo style exhibitions, and then they have their show. The artists who were selected have an exhibition in one of our gallery spaces. So we have 6 solo shows on view right now as part of Solos 2022, and one of them is a solo exhibition by Alexander D'Agostino, who's with us here tonight, called Lavender Shrine. And I actually have to acknowledge too that a lot of credit for tonight's program goes to Alexander. David's book, which we'll be discussing, I know was a big part of his research for the exhibition. And so the idea of having the conversation is something that we came up with in conversation. Might have been his idea. I don't really remember whose idea was, but it was a good idea. I'm really glad we've been able to do it as part of the show. So I'm going to do just a little bit of information about some upcoming events we have. Also in conjunction with the conversation tonight and with Alexander's exhibition, we are also sponsoring, Arlington Arts Center is sponsoring a virtual screening of the documentary, The Lavender Scare, which came out a few years ago and is based in large part on Dr. Johnson's research, which you'll be hearing about tonight. It's a really fantastic documentary, and it's available through our website with the password AAC, all lowercase, for the next week. So starting today and up until June 14th, you'll be able to watch that. It's on the event page on our website, and I'll also put a link directly to the screening page in the chat with the password as well, so folks have access to that. We are doing an additional Pride event actually this Saturday. We do a family-friendly Pride celebration. This is our second year in a row having that event. So that's this Saturday from 10:30 a.m. to 2:30 at Arlington Arts Center. We'll be doing Drag Queen Story Hour, and we'll have an art making activity, and our galleries will also be open. So you'll be able to come in and see the shows. And so hopefully some of you who are out there can come see us in person for that. It would also be an opportunity to come see Alex's show in person as well. Alex's exhibition is up through June 18th. So if you can't make it this Saturday, you've got one more week. And hopefully, I always say this over and over on virtual events, but it really is fantastic and so important to see your work in person. So if you are in the DC area, I would really recommend coming to Arlington to see the work in person after the talk tonight. All that being said, I'm going to do quick introductions of our speakers, and then we're actually going to show the trailer for the documentary, which will give people some context. And then I'm going to hand it over to Alexander, and he will show some images of the work. And while showing the images of the work, have some questions for David to sort of start a conversation. We will also have some time for questions at the end, so you can put those questions in the Q&A. I think we are probably going to mostly do Q&A at the end, but if you have questions and want to put them in there when they come to mind, please do that. And hopefully we'll have some good conversation at the end as well. So to start with the introductions, Alexander D'Agostino is an interdisciplinary artist and teacher based in Baltimore, Maryland. He graduated from the Maryland Institute College of Art in 2009 with a BFA in painting, and he investigates the queer and otherworldly through dance, ritual, teaching, and visual art. His work has been presented at Vox Populi in Philadelphia, Viz Arts in Rockville, Maryland, the Center for Contemporary Art of Afghanistan in Kabul, the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Walters Art Museum, Shashama's Summer Performance Series in Manhattan, the Itinerant Performance Art Festival at the Queens Museum, and at Transformer in Washington, DC. And our other speaker tonight, who we're really happy to have here, is Dr. David K. Johnson. He is a historian, award-winning author, and a nationally recognized authority on LGBT history. His book, The Lavender Scare, which you'll be hearing more about this evening, was published in 2004 and has inspired a novel, a play, and an opera, and was the basis for the award-winning documentary film, The Lavender Scare, which I mentioned before. He is a professor in the history department at the University of South Florida and holds a BA from Georgetown University and a PhD from Northwestern University, both in history. Dr. Johnson has appeared on CNN, PBS, and CBS Sunday Morning, and his writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Huffington Post, and Foreign Policy. He has enjoyed fellowships from the National Humanities Center, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Social Science Research Council. And his most recent book, which I think will also come up a little bit tonight, is called Buying Gay, How Physique Entrepreneurs Sparked a Movement. That book chronicles the rise of a gay commercial mail order network in the years before the Stonewall riots, and looks at how gay commerce was not a byproduct, but rather an important catalyst for the gay rights movement. So also really interesting research. So let's see, I am going to screen share really quickly so we can watch the trailer like I mentioned, or the documentary, and then I will get out of the way and let the conversation start.
We have your friend in the next room. She's already told us that you're gay. You give us the names of others and we'll go easier on you.
Committee will please come to order.
Homosexuals must not be handling top secret material. The pervert is easy prey to the blackmailer.
It started this Lavender Scare. It started this systematic campaign to identify and remove all suspected gay men and lesbians from the Federal Civil Service.
I was called to the FBI office.
They wouldn't allow legal representation.
I was a scared kid.
They wouldn't reveal the evidence.
They said, we have information, you are homosexual. Do you have any comment?
And they would threaten exposure.
I submitted my resignation.
I lost my job at the patent office.
That was the end of it. I was out. I was the first person to fight back out of all of those huge number of people that were fired in the 50s.
And in 1965, he led a protest outside the White House, which was both an act of conscience, but also an act of extraordinary courage. We are proud of you, Frank, and we are grateful to you for your leadership.
The untold story of a vicious witch hunt.
Tens and tens of thousands of people fired from or kept from jobs.
And the courageous few who fought back.
It ended up becoming something much larger. It was about the rights of all gay men and lesbians.
The Lavender Scare.
So that gives you a little bit of sense of the documentary, and I'm going to turn it over to Alex if you want to share your screen.
Yeah. Oh, what is going? I think you can see my situation, and that was a foreshadowing. So let me. Okay. You're seeing the talk before it happened because that's okay. This is just an image of the overall installation Lavender Shrine that I created for the Arlington Art Center Solos. And as Blair had mentioned, David's book, The Lavender Scare, was a crucial text for my research. And I thought I would just ask you, David, to talk a little bit about, give some background on what the Lavender Scare was for people who might not know about what it is.
Sure. Hi, Alex. Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
Sure. The Lavender Scare. I like to think of it as it was a fear, right? It was a fear that kind of permeated Cold War political culture. This fear that gay people had somehow infiltrated the federal government and that they posed a threat to national security and needed to be systematically removed from government service. It starts really with Joseph McCarthy, right? We all know about Joseph McCarthy and his, fight against communists. But what most people don't know is that he also, in the list that he supposedly held in his hand of subversives in the State Department, they weren't just communists. There were several homosexuals on the list too. And in many ways, it was that fear of, well, sex perverts, as your shroud, uses, the fear that sex perverts had infiltrated the federal government actually caused, in many ways, more of a stir, more more concern among American citizens than the threat of communists.
Which is interesting because when I learned about the Red Scare in high school, I had no clue that there was a Lavender Scare as well, which I think is something that most people seem to be kind of shocked about. Since I had kind of told you before, what initially actually started my I should learn more about the Lavender Scare was a moment in the pandemic when I was gifted a box of my neighbor's uncle's box of vintage gay porn, although in the arts I might say, what is it, mid-century erotica, I think is the more polite language. But I thought it was really fascinating to see images of sexuality that sometimes I think I maybe had thought that there wasn't much of that, although I am an avid collector of physique pictorial. To see this box, this collection, seemed to me almost like a portrait of someone's desire, but also the fact that it had been hidden in a dusty basement. That seemed rather common. I feel like throughout the months of doing this process, other people had mentioned that they had discovered a mysterious box of dirty magazines at some point, and that seems to be often the story behind these publications. So this shroud wall, the Lavender shrine queer shroud grid I created was sort of the initial process of that, recreating images from the magazines, but also started to borrow images from the Lavender Scare itself. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about how, kind of expand on what's the subject of your new book, how buying gay and buying gay magazines and just in general, how gay publications really helped develop and kind of catalyze gay culture.
Yeah. Alex, I think there's a picture of the work you mentioned.
Well, this might be that. Do you mean like, well, this is from the I think that was the
okay, you mentioned the grid. I wasn't sure if you were going to switch to that. Sorry.
Oh, but I do have, well, yeah, I can, one thing I think actually be sort of interesting to show. So in Physique Pictorial magazines, which were these fabulous publications, you'll, spoiler alert, nudity, but you'll see these images and these little symbols often next to the stories or the images that you see. And this was sort of the code that was used, the subjective character analysis, essentially to give you some insight to the person, because there seemed to be a strange reason that the images themselves couldn't be more erotic. So I'm wondering, David, if you could talk just about early gay porn and how that defined the community.
I love that that's how you started this project, was this, somebody's box of physique magazines, because, well, for me, the Lavender Scare began in the attic of one of the victims of the Lavender Scare, Fred Kameny, who I think we're going to talk about later. But amongst all of his materials were some physique magazines, and that I saw. And at the time I thought, well, those are really interesting, but that's not really, the story I want to tell. That's not really the important, political story about the community. But my second book basically comes back and says, well, actually, yeah, it is. Those magazines were really important. In some ways, maybe more important, because it allowed gay men, and it was only gay men, to kind of find each other through these magazines by buying them, um, buying the images. A lot of them had, you could mail in, you could get pictures published, you could get letters published, you could buy other items associated with these physique magazines, like greeting cards and clothing. It created this kind of sense of a national gay community. You knew there were other men like you, or boys in some cases like you, out there, looking at the same images and buying the same stuff. And I mean, in some ways, the magazines themselves were kind of coded, even without. I mean, Bob Miser had those very specific codes about some of the models, but the whole magazines were kind of a code, right? They pretended to be bodybuilding magazines, but what I learned in my research is nobody was fooled by that, right? Everybody knew that these were gay magazines. These were clearly homoerotic images, and they often have, one model looking at the other, or they're, two models in a pool, splashing around. They were very homoerotic, and everybody knew it, which is why the post office tried to shut them down. So they also, not only did they kind of create this sense of a community, but they created a sense of an oppressed community, because the government was trying to shut the magazines down. And some of the first gay rights legal victories were over the right to publish these magazines.
And so essentially, like, as people were they were going into more circulation and getting more visibility, was that what kind of sparked some of the efforts of the post office to shut these magazines down?
Yeah, the post office, they were they were concerned about straight porn too, to be fair, but
Yeah.
they seemed particularly concerned about these because they knew, as you said, the example you showed, right? It wasn't, pornographic and even in the legal situation then, right? It wasn't full frontal male nudity, right? It was so, but they considered it obscene because they knew that it was other men who were looking at it, right? It was an example of homosexuality. That's why they considered it obscene.
That's something that I thought was kind of interesting when thinking about the Lavender Scare, was that just the idea of men having conversation with each other or images of male intimacy were already considered obscene. So it was sort of an early example of kind of behavioral policing in a way. And that made me, one thing I think a lot about when I look at these magazines and I try to place myself in that moment in history is, I think, where would I have been able to find a culture like mine? And obviously these magazines, but then I also think about the just public access to other people, which maybe in some ways is reflected in my Tiffany windows. If you go to Arlington Art Center, you'll actually see there's the Tiffany Gallery and these original Tiffany stained glass windows from the Abbey Mausoleum in the Arlington Cemetery are there. And there is an image in your book of men having an outing at the cemetery. I don't necessarily think it was like a cruising situation, although I feel like there's this unspoken mythology of public places as one of the only places people could go to live their sexualities or have the experiences that were of their bodies. So I wonder if you could talk, I guess, a little bit more about that too, or just, not necessarily the Tiffany windows, maybe more in DC, I guess, if you could talk about Lafayette Square and what that was and how that became both a agora and a meeting place, but also in some ways maybe high risk because people knew that was where you could get the gays.
Right. Yeah, I mean, public spaces like Lafayette Park, right across the street from the White House, a very prominent, spot in downtown DC, was a known gay cruising area since the 1920s. People all over the country would know about it. but yeah, it's also dangerous, right? Because the police knew about it too. It was heavily policed. After part of the sort of post World War II panic about sexuality and sex crimes involved a crackdown on Lafayette Park. The park police literally called it the pervert elimination campaign. And they sent, cops there. Sometimes they would arrest people, sometimes they wouldn't arrest them, but they would, stop them and interrogate them and basically try to, harass them and scare them. And then once Joseph McCarthy, gets going and, says this is a threat to national security, a lot of those names, ended up being sent to the Civil Service Commission. And those people, if they worked for the government, right, got fired. So yeah, it was, Lafayette Park is like a sign of gay people trying to find each other and find community, but also about the danger of it. And in the 50s, it becomes even more dangerous.
Which is interesting to think that, like, kind of right before the Red Scare and Lavender Scare, it seems like DC was like one of the gayest cities in the country. I feel like I had heard some statistic. I don't know if it was like the idea was like, it was like 75% of the people there were gay, or that's probably the romanticized exaggeration. But what was it about DC that distracted?
It is, yeah, it's pretty, I think it's still pretty gay. It's always, when the first census asked a question, which was in the 90s, I think, about, it didn't ask about gay people, but it asked about roommates that were like, I forgot how the language was, but it was seen as measuring gay couples. And the second gayest city after San Francisco was Washington, D.C. And it starts, yeah, certainly in the teens or the 20s and 30s, when Washington is kind of a boom town during the New Deal, and then even more so during World War II. There's lots of young people moving to DC for jobs, government jobs, good paying jobs. And a lot of them, not a lot, a certain percentage, certainly a pretty large percentage, are gay people trying to get away from their small towns and move to the big city where there's opportunities. And Washington was that. And the people who describe it say, they weren't being harassed. They were pretty open. They could, display same-sex affection on streetcars and stuff, and nobody would do anything.
Almost like it was, because there wasn't really an established like gay community. It was sort of just something that was understood in a way. I wonder, like, people recognized that there was homosexuality and that there were roommates and people coupling, but there wasn't any public moral outcry. So I guess at the time, what would still be like pre-Lavender Scare or leading up to that, what would have been like the average American's opinion of homosexuality? I wonder.
The average American's, if that's a good question, the average American's opinion of homosexuality. Well, they probably thought it was, a sin, maybe an illness. They also probably didn't think too much about it, right? Until it becomes a sort of a national political issue during the Cold War.
That for some reason is reminding me of years ago when I was living with my previous partner when I was in art school. And my landlady was like, wow, you roommates are funny. You only have one bed. And I thought that was an interesting, I'm like, wow, that seems so old fashioned, but I guess some people just slip between the cracks that in some ways, because it's invisible, there was almost sometimes maybe more permission to exist. Or maybe, I don't know. That's just stuff that I think about. And that's perhaps why I tend to think about this. I had mentioned, like, one thing I do when I'm working is I love to listen to different books on tape and Audible. So in addition to listening to Lavender Scare, a lot of the production of this show was listening to like the Practical Magic book series, mainly because I love me some spooky looking spell books. But I think the connection between old magical books that have a history of being kind of confiscated or muzzled or made illegal, some ways parallels the history of pornography and of tape publication. So I don't know, I guess something I'm always looking for are moments in history where things existed, whether or not we thought they did. This is just an image from one of the Queer Shroud grimoires that I created. And you can see on the right is just some collage images from the magazines. And on the left is an early Mattachine Society publication or image that essentially was trying to educate people about homosexuality. And you can see that there's in the background 2 zebras with stripes looking at a spotted zebra. And I think that's a really, I don't know, I thought that was an endearing way to illustrate homosexuality. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the Mattachine.
Oh, I'm not seeing that image right now. I'm
Oh,
seeing
is it not?
I'm seeing the physique.
Yeah, I am as well. I was just trying to figure out if it was just me.
Oh no. Is it what is, are you able to see the windows in the book?
No.
No, we're seeing the grid still. I wonder if you maybe stop sharing and then just reshare. It might just have sort of. Oh, there we go.
Ah, there we go.
Resume share.
There's the-
Did it work?
Yes.
Did
Now
it work?
yeah, we see the windows in the book now. Yep.
Okay.
There we go. There they are.
Okay. I might just not do a full up screen for it in case that has something to do with it. But here is a early Mattachine Society publication, or just a pamphlet that they put out. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Mattachine Society in the context of this history.
Yeah, so they're a group founded in California in 1950, the first avowedly, well, gay organization in the country. And they have sort of radical beginnings, but they quickly become fairly conservative, right? Because it's, it's the Cold War, and they're afraid of being shut down. The post office tries to shut their magazine down as well. So they're pretty tame. So it's interesting that you have, which is one reason maybe why they used these animals to illustrate homosexuality rather than real live people. They also it would have been difficult for them to find, gay people to have their picture used in Mattachine Review in the 50s. There were very few people willing to be open, about it. And you've got it, it's kind of cool. You've got it contrasted with what I assume is from one of the physique magazines. Or what is that from?
That's from the vintage porn I got. So he has a few physique, but some of it gets like Drummer magazine. And,
okay, which is later, right? Which is
he has a whole
70s
life of a taste in his box.
Yes, but it shows the kind of the transformation from this very tame, kind of timid Mattachine Society, which wouldn't even show images sometimes of gay people, to this sort of explosion of sexuality, in the 70s.
And where did the idea, like the name Mattachine Society, like how was that arrived at, or where did that come from?
Harry Hay comes up with that name. He was he was a member of the Communist Party. He was a student of history and European history, and discovered this term that was used in Renaissance Italy to describe these court jesters, they were groups of men who wore masks at court and were able to tell the truth because they wore masks. So even in the name, there's this idea of sort of covering up while trying to speak out at the same time.
which does seem to be a strategy of civil rights activism, specifically in gay rights movements, I've noticed. And that's the thing about the Lavender Scare is, for me personally, with the work I was creating, I didn't want it to just be the illegality of homosexuality and that component. I was really inspired by the activism of everything. And the next image is kind of a piece that I thought was a little bit about this sort of contemporary conversation, or at least one of the more recent places in the media and the news where the history of the Lavender Scare was brought up. In this piece, I call it a spell to rename the James Webb Telescope. And when I created it, I was really responding to the petition that various astronomers had kind of put out to halt the name of the James Webb Telescope. Allegedly, he was incredibly homophobic, and upon some digging, discovered that he was kind of misquoted as being a very blatant homophobic individual, when in some ways he was no more complicit in this than any other person in the federal, in the government at that time. So I thought it was this sort of interesting thing that happens where sometimes you see an intense desire to uplift the history of people who were underrepresented, but sometimes things get lost in translation. So I just wondered if you could maybe give your historical take on this situation.
Yeah, the naming of the James Webb Telescope is a complicated controversy, and I'm glad on the one hand that it's kind of raised the profile of the Lavender Scare and the activists who object to naming the telescope after Webb, are trying to do their history and publicize the Lavender Scare, which is great. But yeah, and if they were naming it, the Joseph McCarthy Telescope, I wouldn't be behind that. But I haven't found any evidence that James Webb was particularly, homophobic. He was around at the time and a government official, but there was really nobody standing up in the 50s and saying, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. Not even gay people were standing up and saying this is wrong. Everyone, like I said, this was a fear that permeated Cold War political culture. Everybody, including a lot of gay people, kind of bought into it, that gay people were a threat to national security.
Even gay people were buying into that?
Yeah, I mean,
makes sense. Was it the I think from what I understand too, a lot of it was that gay people were more vulnerable to blackmail, and so more likely to be a security threat, to be the false narrative.
Right, that's the official kind of narrative, yes. But there wasn't any evidence for that, right? Even though there was a investigation right in the summer of 1950 about it. And they called all kinds of security people, and they all said that gay people were, subject to blackmail and therefore threats to national security. But there was no evidence for it. It was all based on a myth.
Which seems to be something that sort of is showing up today in the very current political climate. Even the controversy of Drag Queen Story Hour could in some ways be this false narrative that these perverts are ruining the moral fabric of the youth or something. So.
Right, and there's no evidence of trans people, attacking people in restrooms, or it's just, or trans athletes, defeating,
yeah, the one high school student that this law is being created, these laws are seeming to be created for. And it just seems to be something that regurgitates itself throughout history, although today it seems more nasty and mean-spirited, but maybe that's just because we have social media to hear what people are saying. I find it, on that topic, I find it really interesting that most of the legislation, the anti-trans legislation, usually is like protecting women in sports. So it already seems to be coded in some kind of sexist narrative, protecting women. I'm like, what about trans men? But that's, I don't know. I think that in some ways, when I created this piece, I was also thinking about the sort of current cultural approach to how we uplift people from the past. I thought it was interesting that the alternative name that the petition suggested was to call it the Harriet Tubman Telescope, because she led people to freedom following the light of the North Star. And then I was thinking, well, there's other people who were also into the stars, speaking out about gay rights.
Could be the Frank Kameny Telescope. Yes, that would be great.
It could be, yeah. So,
well, he was, and it makes sense because he actually was an astronomer.
Yeah, he was a brilliant astronomer. And could you talk a little bit more about Kameny and his significance and gay rights activism in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, he's kind of how I got into this story to begin with. I was, a gay man living in DC, and I was a member of the Gay Lesbian Activists Alliance, which is still active, I think, in DC. It's one of the oldest continuously active LGBT organizations. And I was doing a little history of just of that group. And Frank Kameny was an active member at the time. This was in the 90s. And he showed me his attic full of his own personal papers and the papers of the organization he founded, because he was one of the victims of the Lavender Scare. He had a PhD from Harvard as an astronomer. He started working for the government, the Army Map Service. He was helping the U.S. Target its ICBM weapons at the Soviet Union. And it's the height of the space race, right? It's in 1957. And the US needs astronomers, but they discover that Frank Kameny is gay. He'd been arrested in one of these known gay cruising areas. And so they fire him. And he doesn't really understand. He doesn't know about this whole history that we've been talking about. He just thinks it's like a mistake or something. And he tries to get it corrected, and he fights it, and he writes letters and eventually files suit in court and tries to take it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court doesn't want to hear it. But in the process of that struggle, he articulates this idea that this situation is not about morality. It's not about national security. That's ridiculous. He says this is a civil rights issue, right? And you are treating me as a second-class citizen. So he really reframes this. And as I said, he failed in his personal struggle, but then he founds a new chapter of the Mattachine Society in Washington, and they become much more militant, and they start picketing in front of the White House by 1965, and maybe even more importantly, he starts helping other fired civil servants, and there are thousands of them at this point. Help some of them bring other court cases to the courts, and they start by the late 1960s. They're winning. The courts are saying to the civil service, you can't prove a connection between somebody's off-duty conduct, sexual conduct, and their ability to perform their job. Basically force the civil service to change their policy.
Yeah, he seems rather forceful in the film. I wonder, meeting him in person, I would imagine it was a character to interact with.
He is a character, yes. He's a force of nature. He's somewhat cantankerous, but they picked with the wrong guy when they started when they fired Frank Kameny. He wasn't having it, and thank God, right? There are thousands, millions of us who are profiting from his anger and his activism.
Yeah, I think that you sort of mentioned this, but the level of the sort of context shift or the shift in thinking that he pushed through, it really struck me when watching the film that at the time, people had reached out to the American Civil Liberties Union to defend gay people who'd been fired to defend them, and the ACLU considered it to be not an issue for them. Like they didn't think of it as a civil rights issue. Frank Kameny really sort of turned that into, changed the way people thought of it to that dramatic extent.
He had to push even the ACLU to think of this differently. Yeah, absolutely.
So was part of it that gay community or gay culture wasn't really established at that point, so people didn't see it as like a group of people that needed civil rights issues attended to, or was that part of why?
I mean, I guess it was certainly less, much less of a community than today, but there were gay bars, there were these magazines, there was a sense of community, and there was a growing sense of this, but it hadn't really been articulated. They've been articulated by there were a few other people who were doing this at the same time, people like Donald Webster Corey, who wrote about the homosexual in America, but it's Frank Kameny who kind of takes this to court, writes it down. The physique publishers are doing the same thing at this point in their lawsuits, right? They're saying, well, if straight people can look at Playboy, gay men can look at physique pictorial, right? It's a matter of equality.
I like that logic. He's definitely I read he's like the grandfather of gay rights, and I feel like hearing him talk, definitely you see that necessary cranky personality that comes with I don't know what he was able to accomplish. And I think that is just something that strikes me with this history. Was this just the courage that people needed to have in order to come out, but also to be publicly homosexual. When I think I had mentioned in making these queer shrouds, I kind of sometimes think that they become like the individual spirits of the people whose stories we didn't get to hear, the people who weren't fired but had to resign, and all this sort of invisible suicide that happened because of this. And I think that it's the saddest thing to me is that it's kind of hard to find those moments in history that prove that people took their lives because of this, albeit a few people who is it? Andrew, I'm blanking on his name.
Andrew Ferenz, yes.
Yeah. Can you talk about his story?
Yeah, well, the whole process, right, was kind of invisible and hidden, right? Unlike with the Red Scare, which largely transpires, on Capitol Hill and in front of congressional hearings, and the interrogations of gay people all happened behind closed doors, out of the spotlight. And actually, certainly the people being interrogated didn't want to publicize it. And actually, in some ways, the government interrogators didn't either. So, it remained kind of hidden. People, the language at the time was these people resigned voluntarily, right? Rather than fight or rather than have their names exposed, they sort of quietly disappeared. In the case of Andrew Ferenz, he was interrogated by officials at the State Department about his relationship with his romantic relationship with his roommate, and he went back to their apartment where they lived in Paris. He worked at the U.S. Embassy there and turned on the gas oven and committed suicide. And we know about this because there was his family. Oh, we know about it because the State Department lied about it. They kind of they covered it up. They obviously, because of the suicide, they had to tell the family something, and they made up a story about Andrew Frenz's health, and the family didn't believe it. So they went to their member of Congress and had them investigate, and there was a file opened about about him, as there is when a member of Congress gets involved and starts sending letters to the executive branch, and I found that file in the National Archives. And I'm sure there are many more, cases of suicide that we don't know about. But Andrew Friends is one that's we do know about.
And you were able to access those files because of the Freedom of Information Act. Is that correct, or was that?
Not that one in particular. Think so. I think that was just there. But I did find a lot of materials through the Freedom of Information Act, which is a really amazingly strong law that's kind of unique in some ways to the United States. Thank you, Lyndon Johnson, part of the Great Society.
Was that one of the, would you say that act had a huge role in your research, or just in the Lavender Scare book you created, as far as being able to access that, or for people in this country to be able to access information?
Yeah, for researchers, it's incredibly important. For individuals also to request your own files. I think that's how Madeline Tress got her FBI file. She was also resigned voluntarily from the Commerce Department in the 50s. Yeah, we know about her interrogation. It's sort of recreated in the film because she was able to obtain her FBI records.
Can you talk a little bit about her interrogation or her story?
Yeah, she was in her 20s. She just started out at the Department of Commerce. She had I think she had a BA from I forgot now, from like NYU. Anyway, she was very well credentialed. She had a master's degree. She thought she was beginning this great career in international commerce. And the civil service commission investigators just call her in one day, say, come with us, and start asking her about what they called known homosexuals, friends of hers. Did she know them? Had she been to the Redskins Lounge? And said, we know you are a homosexual. What do you want to say about it? She said it was the most frightful and demeaning experience she'd ever had.
I think they said, like, you've never had it until you've had it from a man, or something really horrible like that. It seems like also one of the only, I feel like a lot of, when I look into the Lavender Scare, it's a lot more stories about men, but it's also women were just as affected by this too. And I think about how someone could be, like, she was described as wearing overly tailored clothes. And so you start to see like the just behavior of individuals being policed, whether it was their clothes or how they spoke. I think I remember in the film, they even had like a note of just, you should investigate their time when they were in the costume department. It's based on what someone did as work could be enough to accuse them of being a homosexual and lose their jobs, which is interesting too, to think that, there were certain areas where it was just almost assumed that people were homosexual, like in the arts, like that seems to be kind of a code for homosexual.
Right. Exactly.
And
yes.
I think Lavender Lad was also a code. And that's what this piece is called, Lavender Lad. And I think this is actually from the magazines, and you can see some Mattachine imagery there. But to me, the image of someone being muzzled really spoke a lot to this moment in history. But why was lavender the gay color in the government?
That's cool. I love Lavender Lads. That's great. So lavender was associated with homosexuality because it was a mixture of colors, because it was sort of blue and red, or or pink and blue, sort of male female colors. So it became associated with homosexuality. And they talked about the lavender lads in the State Department.
And that was sort of where that term, the lavender, is that when you were like, I will call this the lavender scare, or how that happened?
No, so actually someone else, I can't claim credit for the term. Another historian, Jeffrey Smith, used it first. And I guess I sort of stole it or appropriated it from him. But I owe it to my one of my dissertation committee members at Northwestern, Nancy McLean, who circled it in the dissertation and said, "This is your title."
Huh. I like that. That's really cool. I mean, I love lavender, and I feel like it's a great thing to associate with homosexuality, even if it has a sort of darker history. But yeah, that was what this kind of piece seemed to be thinking about. So the other things that I, created work about, or kind of mixing the images of the Tiffany windows with my own kind of research into this, led me to various people like John Fryer, or Dr. Anonymous, who gave a speech in 1975, 72 at the American Psychiatric Association annual conference. And he had to disguise himself. So he wore this rather disturbing looking mask. I think when I look at it, I like that it feeds people's horror imagination. Most people, when they would see this image, think that it's like John Wayne Gacy or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it's actually a theatrical, flamboyant individual who wore a mask. He kind of distorted his voice, and I believe he was sitting next to an activist, Barbara Giddings, and Kameny at the time, and essentially says, I'm a homosexual. And so that's kind of what this piece was thinking about. But I guess I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how fear kind of acted as a tool for enacting these homophobic witch hunts in the federal workforce, which led people to cover their faces in many ways.
Oh yeah, fear. Well, and he right. So he was right, a psychiatrist, right? Who I mean, the Kameny and Giddings and other activists have been trying to change the American Psychiatric Association's consideration of homosexuality as an illness for quite some time, but they were acting as outsiders, right? These outside activists, they at some point actually stormed some of the meetings. But John Fryer was the first psychiatrist at one of these meetings to come out as gay. But it's kind of crazy to think that he felt he had to wear this mask, right? I mean, it's fear, and so it's not only it's fear, straight people's fear of gay people, but gay people's fear themselves, right? Of the consequences of being outed that would, make him feel that he had to wear a mask like that. I mean, and that was only what, less than 50 years ago.
And this moment in some ways was one of the reasons why homosexuality was declassified as a mental illness. But it's just interesting too, reading about him, that he was fired off and they would say, you can be gay or you can be flamboyant, but you can't be flamboyant and gay. And I think about, other words they would use, like fairy was a common word to describe like a feminine gay man, or a derogatory word for that. And so in this moment in history, it was also somewhat insidious because it was turning gay people against their own people. If someone was very theatrical, flamboyant, homosexual, just by associating with that person, you could be risking your own livelihood. So I see that, I don't know, in some ways, this sometimes still trickles into today, where people maybe aren't as comfortable with their sexuality and they kind of want to distance themselves from the fairies and artists. So I don't know, that was just something that struck a nerve in my very little heart. When I first did this piece, I dressed up as, I became someone called the Lavender Scary Fairy when I was doing a piece of Transformer. And I walked through Logan Circle just handing out lavender to people, but thinking about embodying the kind of spooky boogeyman that we create of the homosexual. That seems to be always what happens with queer people, is whether it's homosexuals, whether it's people in the trans community, are sometimes scapegoated as this monstrous person that's hiding in the bathrooms or waiting to destroy the children in the family. That's very uncomfortable, but important to think about, I guess. And so another window I created was an image of the interim report from the Hoey committee. Hoey or Hoey?
Yeah, I was Hoey, right? Or no, it's the one that's, yeah.
Hoey.
So it doesn't sound like the word, yeah. So it's the Hoey committee, I think.
Yeah. And what exactly was the Hoey committee, or how did that?
So when Joseph McCarthy in February 1950 makes these charges about these communists and, it turns out, homosexuals in the State Department, and it causes lots of attention because he claims he has this list. And so there are these a series of investigations on Capitol Hill, you know, kind of to look into, is there anything behind these charges? And so in the summer of 1950, there's this long, very serious closed door investigation into the employment of homosexuals and other sex perverts in the government. And they end up publishing this report. It gets pretty widely circulated. It gets, you know, sent to embassies all over the world, and it kind of establishes the truth, quote unquote, right, of this narrative that gay people pose a threat to national security. It seems to offer proof, right? Because it's, you know, it's printed by the U.S. Senate, and it makes these claims, even though there's actually nothing, you know, no, they can't point to a single individual, right, who's a gay individual who's betrayed secrets.
So a lot of the content of this report was essentially fabricated, or from I looked into a little bit of it. It seems like some of it was just sort of descriptions of how people could recognize homosexuality in people, or not recognize it, but it seemed like it was creating these fake character traits of homosexuality, it seems. Or is that something that was in the report?
Well, the report actually talks about how, you know, how homosexuals are actually hard to find. That, you know, you can't just you know, identify them visually. So, you know, which kind of makes it even scarier, right? Like, in other words, they may look just like, you know, you or your neighbor. They could be anywhere, right? And they may look, you know, just like you, and they may, you know, but they're, you know, but they're there and they're a threat, and we need to remove them. So we need, you know, these new policies, new ways of interacting between the police and the civil service, and, you know, basically a kind of clampdown. And it leads by, in 1953, when Eisenhower is elected, there's a change of administration. The Democrats are thrown out because they're the party of, you know, of the communists and the queers. And one of the first things Eisenhower does is pass an executive order with a new, stricter security system. And one of the, you know, things that's verboten for civil servants is any evidence of sexual perversion.
Essentially, pervert was, in some ways, or sex pervert was sort of synonymous with homosexual in a way at the time, or sexual deviant.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's the thing that's so frightening too, is this idea was at government documents and how it creates sort of the moral climate. So people were maybe already trying to do their patriotic duty and searching for the homosexuals in their community. So it feels like this, in some ways, just feeds that sort of witch hunt narrative of looking for behavior in people, and that that sort of connects to this other piece I created that has some images from some U.S. Magazines, but then the How to Spot a Homo is from a 1962 Sunday Mirror, it's a UK publication. And I was like, well, I'll put the spotted zebra because that's a spotted homo, I suppose. But when I read that article, I mean, it's the image you can kind of see with the face next to the zebra. It's just a man lying in bed, and it seems like kind of an unflattering image. And it really describes like these bizarre bodily traits and behavioral traits that would indicate that someone is a homosexual, whether it's men having a little bit more conversational flow. That's not thought to be something that's very typical masculine behavior. So that's usually a sign of someone being a homosexual, or wearing certain colors, having your hair done a certain way. And even the language in these magazines would kind of feed into that fear that there were people that were just in your neighborhood. It could be anyone. But I also thought it was sort of shocking to think that how the Lavender Scare kind of affected the international view of homosexuality. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the Lavender Scare did affect the world at large.
Sure, and you're right. I mean, it took so little to to raise suspicions about a civil servant. You know, if they walked the wrong way, they had too many, you know, if you were a man, too many male friendships, or if you were a woman, too many female friendships, and reports of workers, you know, suggesting that other workers, you know, or a woman had odd-shaped lips, or not much in the way of hips, or you know, anything. It's just weird. Any slight deviation from a kind of very standard traditional sense of male and female would put you under suspicion. But that kind of security regime, which gets started under Eisenhower, and that other coworkers are helping, it does in some ways spread to America's allies, right? The Cold War is going on. It's absolutely, you know, controlling American foreign policy, and the United States is telling its allies, if you want to share information with us, or if we're going to share information with you, you have to have the same kind of security policies that we have, which included getting rid of gay people. And places like the UK and Canada and Australia went along. They didn't always necessarily agree with it or think it was really necessary, but they kind of had to, basically because, you know, the United States was the predominant power. And so, yeah, there are examples of, certainly in Canada, there were great purges carried out by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And in our other, and even at the United Nations, we pressured the United Nations to do a purge there as well.
I'm happy that didn't last for too long, although it's interesting because it still seems like in some ways it is starting to happen again, or it's always just as much as we might think we've, you know, achieved a lot of equal rights through legislation, there still seems to be always more and more people can put on queer people, whether it's noticing like 18 states now have anti-trans legislation. And I think that outside of those laws, that even though we might see them as being kind of silly and absurd, they seem to also create kind of a moral panic or a moral climate for people to do the dirty work of the government, and sort of invisible witch hunts that are happening today, I think seem to be reflected or started from the Lavender Scare, these moments in history. And that's just something that, I guess, why I think this conversation and this history is important for people to know about, because sometimes people can think that there was no gay culture or there was no effort to stop this kind of discrimination, but it's been happening forever. So
Yes.
I don't know. Yeah,
And it's, yeah, it does feel a little bit like another moral panic.
what do you think where do you think this leads, your perception?
Well, but I think the difference is, I mean, it does feel like a moral panic in that it's, you know, the fear of the other, that mostly trans people, based on nothing, and focused on children and education, because, you know, that's the easiest target. I mean, we saw that in the 70s as well, with people like Anita Bryant, right, who had the Save Our Children crusade, which was really a crusade against you know, LGBT civil rights. But focusing on children is always an easy way for the conservatives to attack the community.
Yeah, it seems the new. Oh, sorry.
But the difference is, I mean, back then we didn't have, you know, strong LGBT institutions like we do today. You know, so I think we're in a better position, certainly, to fight it.
Sometimes I almost imagine that it's like with these new laws, it's like bringing all the foolish insanity out of the woodwork. So it's like we might in the United States have had a big problem with termites and cockroaches, but swept it under the rug. And now all these people have been beholden to claim these weird moral standards. It somehow seems also to be like a weird nostalgia. I feel like when I hear people say stuff about the communists today, or like this socialism and communism are going to ruin our country, I'm like, what grandfather did you have that told you that the communist is the evil person in our country? So I don't know, it does seem a little scary, but I like that, to think that there is a lot more strength in the LGBTQ community right now. So they can try, but they won't get too far, I hope. So.
Well, we have a couple questions. I wanted to make sure we had a little bit of time for questions. It's okay to hop to. Great. Let's see. So one question we had in the chat from Thomas, who's made a few comments. So thanks for Thomas for engaging and having some really great stories about DC in the past. So Thomas asks, I understand that the gay community thrived in places such as Harlem and Berlin in the 1920s and 1930s. What changed to drive it underground?
The Nazis.
Right, Berlin.
Right. I mean, I don't mean to be funny about it, but yeah, there was a backlash, right? I mean, that's part of the story of the Lavender Scare, is that it also in the United States was kind of a backlash against a period of openness and visibility during the war, during the 20s and 30s as well. Which again gets back to the point about today. You know, today it's a backlash, right? Again, because we are now so visible and open, and you know, enjoy these rights, including marriage. I mean, who would have thought? So the history of gender and sexuality in America is a history of advances and backlashes.
So it's a few steps forward, one step back, but yeah, wonder what it is about gender and sexual non-conforming groups throughout history that scares people so much to create these kind of legislations and discriminatory beliefs. Don't know. Maybe we just have more fun. I don't know. Are there other questions?
There are other questions from the audience. There was a question, Alexander, about the process behind your work. So we've, seen a few images and you've talked some about the work and especially the ideas behind the work, but do you want to talk sort of briefly about the actual process, the sort of cyanotype and fabric dye process you're using and how you've translated the archival documents into these fabric pieces?
Yeah, it's a really simple process, actually. The cyanotype is like one of the, like when you see blueprints, it's one of the easiest kind of photography crafts, I guess, one could do at home. It's a chemical that when you put something over a material that's coated in cyanotype and expose it to UV, sunlight, it then creates an image of it. So a lot of times people use cyanotype to print like flower pictures and things like that. But I had discovered, learned that you could also create your own negatives that you could put over the cyanotype treated material, and then it would create these really beautiful images. And then found out that there was a solar reactive dye that does a similar thing. And so it's just kind of a trial and error of creating these images. This content seemed to be the most appropriate for that process because I'm using actual light and shadow to bring light on things that seem to be hidden in the shadow. And so that process just fulfilled a lot of those creative ideas. And it's really, I don't know, I think it's really fun and really messy in a way. Like these larger window prints, you have to kind of get the fabric coated really quickly with the colorful dye and then rush outside in the sun, but you can't expose it for too long. So a lot of the prints themselves were actually exposed across from my house on the parking lot where for the guy who I got the magazines from. So it seems like some kind of creative justice to bring light to this collection on the very parking lot of this person's house. So yeah, thank you, pandemic.
And the solar reactive dye, is that why were you able to find one that has the purple lavender color?
Yeah, it's called
very blue. So
yeah, cyanotype is usually cyan like blue, and this was kind of a chemical developed later after cyanotypes were more popular. I think I just loved that I could play with color more. You can do very elaborate, photography with these and sort of create your own full color prints if you have the patience or precision for that. I think I like the almost abstract expressionist feel of being able to swap color around and create something that I have some control over, but sometimes if it's sunny, it's easier. If it's gray, sometimes the prints look different. And I think that makes it more mysterious and fun. Yeah. And they look like, I don't know, that I called them shrouds because they look like, to me, like the Shroud of Turin. And I think or they had that ghostly, like, how did this image exist? It just happened. And I feel like really this process is so much of like a requiem for all these people whose stories were kind of hidden. And in some ways, it's like a death shroud for their untold stories in a way. So, yeah.
That's very cool.
It's fun. You feel like a wizard. So, yeah.
Well, I'm gonna one last call for any questions, and then it's probably about time for us to wrap up. Or any last questions that either of you have for each other too. David, it struck me, I'm sorry you wouldn't be able to have a chance to see the work in person, but hopefully seeing the images from Alex has given you a sense of
the wonders of Zoom.
You
actually get a wider audience in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can create a really interesting conversation through the World Wide Web. Who would have thought? So, well, that seems to make sense.
Well,
I wanted to have this conversation because I'm always fascinated about how other people, artists and writers, perceive this period. There was a novel kind of inspired by the Lavender Scare. A play, the novel was turned, The Fellow Travelers was turned into an opera, which is kind of a love story, imagining, two State Department employees having an affair during the Lavender Scare. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I was definitely going to say, I feel like when I'm creating my work, I go into the zone of like, I'm doing spiritual medium work, or I like to take on this idea that I'm trying to think about the information that sort of slips between the cracks. And I think that it's interesting. I tend to be like a pretty perky cherry person, and in doing this work, it was definitely like there's a lot of sadness that this history made me feel, and I think a lot of people feel, and yet it also in some ways is comforting to be able to see this history and to talk about it, because whether it's the Salem witch hunts or this Lavender Scare or these new search for the scary trans person in the bathroom kind of thing, there seems to be a history of people unsuccessfully trying to scapegoat people who didn't do anything. So I don't know, the more people learn about it, hopefully the less this kind of stuff happens. It seems like art's a great place when maybe public school isn't allowed to talk about history.
yes. Well, thank you for doing it.
Yeah, thank you so much for writing your book and for taking the time to do this. It really means a lot to me and to all of us. So
yeah, thanks to both of you for being here, and thanks to Alex for creating the work and participating in the show at Arlington Arts Center, which I'm going to pitch one more time. If you're in the area, you come see the work in person at AAC. It's up through June 18th. And we also are hosting the virtual screening of the Lavender Scare from today until June 14th. So I am going to put that link in the chat right now. The password is just AAC, all lowercase.
It will also be appearing on many PBS stations during Pride Month. Another way to see it.
Oh, great. So yeah, take a look at your local PBS station calendar as well. And also David's book is available if you want to learn more of the history as well. Thanks again.
You get the audibles too if you need to combine it with reading and listening. Yeah. But, yeah.
Well, thanks everybody and have a good night.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.